This is from von Franz's interpretation of fairy tales, and she says we must begin by asking why in Jungian psychology we are interested in myths and fairy tales. And she combines the two terms here, myths and fairy tales, but she will make an important distinction between them. And then she makes reference to a conversation she had with C.G. Jung. Dr. Jung, she goes on, once said that it is in fairy tales that one can best study the comparative anatomy of the psyche. In myths or legends or any other more elaborate mythological material, we get at the basic patterns of the human psyche through a lot of cultural material. But in fairy tales, there is much less specific cultural conscious material, and therefore they mirror the basic patterns of the psyche more clearly. And this is probably the most fundamental rationale that Jungians will give for why we study fairy tales. There's a kind of scientific interest. It's probably the most famous single collection of fairy tales ever made, the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm. What I'm showing you here is the title page from a very special edition of that. The illustrations are by a famous English artist named Arthur Rackham. And I'll show you some pictures from that. Here, for instance, is a Rackham drawing painting of an old king and a child. You see the old king dancing on his spindly legs, an old woman holding the baby, and they're rejoicing that there is new life coming into the kingdom. Here's a fairy tale cat by Rackham walking on a ledge. Animals are frequent denizens of fairy tales, and as we'll see in The White Snake, a number of animals play a very important role. Here's a dwarf by Rackham. The images that these illustrators drew became more or less the archetypal images of these figures that later entered the movies and film and so on, and that we associate with such characters. If you read about a dwarf in a fairy tale, maybe something like this will come to your mind. There's a hero on his horse at the side, and the little dwarf telling him something of importance. There's a wonderful collection of fairy tales, Russian fairy tales, and another great illustrator named Boris Zworykin. And this is a collection called The Firebird. And if you look at it carefully, you'll see that Jacqueline Onassis was the editor of this series. In her later years, she worked as an editor in New York. And Zworykin was a marvelous artist. Here you see a picture of the cover of Vasilisa the Fair, a Russian fairy tale. And here's from a Firebird scene by Zworykin. And here's the Snow Maiden. Again, these are Snow Maiden by Zworykin. Fantastic images, capture the imagination. And of course, these picture books are very popular in certain parts of the world. Now I want to talk about a method for interpreting fairy tales that von Franz lays out in her book on the interpretation of fairy tales. And I'm going to talk about three aspects of this method. The aspect of structure, how fairy tales are structured, the method of amplification, working with the images that appear in fairy tales, and the application of psychological theory to the fairy tale in order to get an interpretation. So we begin with von Franz, where she lays out her method for interpreting fairy tales. How do we typographical error there. How do we approach the meaning of a fairy tale, she asks? Or stalk it, rather, because it really is like stalking a very evasive stag. This is von Franz on page 37 of Interpretation of Fairy Tales. She wants to talk about stalking the fairy tale. that the fairy tale is evasive. It's hard to pin down. It's very much like a dream. You never come to an interpretation of a dream where you can say, that's it, finally, we've got everything. We've nailed it to the board. No, it will wiggle out every time, and there will always be another angle and another perspective. So she's treating fairy tales very much like that. We have to stalk them. So it isn't a question of saying exactly what the fairy tale means. It means approaching the fairy tale, getting close to it, spotting it in the woods, and maybe getting to know it a little better and getting to know its underlying significance for the human a little better.